And then we go to Exodus 32, verse 15. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain. But now Moses is going to go down and he's going to see with his own eyes. He goes down with the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets which were written on both sides. They were written on the one side and on the other. The tablets were God's work, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. By the way, these tablets, you get different ideas, and you see in the movies these big, stone, heavy tablets, Moses, kind of walking down the mountain. But these tablets had to have been small enough to fit within the Ark of the Covenant, remember? And the writing is on both sides, the text tells us. Not just on one side, but on both sides. And so Moses is carrying these, and they had to have been small enough, again, to fit within the Ark of the Covenant, remember? And so he carries these tablets down. Verse 17, it says, Now when Joshua heard the sound of the people, so they're getting down close to the camp. And remember, Joshua was Moses' servant. He was his personal aide. And he's waiting further down on the mountain. So here comes Moses down the mountain. And he comes down and he meets Joshua, and they start going down to the camp. And as they approach the camp, it says, Now when Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, There is a sound of war in the camp. He misinterpreted it. And this is one of those examples where perception is not equal to reality. Right? And so he's perceiving something, but his perception is not equal to reality. Because what he hears, he interprets to be the sound of war. But it's an incorrect perception. But he said, Moses speaking here, It is not the sound of the cry of triumph, nor is it the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear. In other words, it's celebration going on. And it came about, as soon as Moses came near the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets from his hand and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. Because at this moment he sees that the Israelites have broken covenant. And they're down there and they're eating and they're drinking and they're singing and they're celebrating and having a wonderful time, all in celebration as they are breaking the covenant. And he gets angry. And rightfully so. Verse 20. And notice what Moses does. He took the calf which they had made, and he burned it with fire and ground it to powder. Literally fine ash and dust. And he scattered it over the surface of the water and made the sons of Israel drink it. He made them drink it. Must have had a bitter taste to it, I bet. What do you think? Probably left a good lasting memory for years to come. I bet they remembered that taste in their mouth. And then Moses said to Aaron, What did this people do to you, that you have brought such great sin upon them? And Aaron said, Do not let the anger of my Lord burn. You know the people yourself that they are prone to evil. Now, is that true? Yeah. Now, isn't that true for a lot of people? Yes. Aren't a lot of people just prone to evil? Sure they are. And this statement, I think, is not only a statement about the Israelites, but about humanity in general. When I read that statement, I could not help but think about Paul in Romans chapter 7. Paul in Romans chapter 7. Because Paul in Romans 7 talks about his personal struggle with sin. In Romans 7:18, and as a believer, we all deal with this because we have two natures. We have the new nature, we have the old nature, and every one of us has that struggle where we're constantly battling between these two natures. Remember the old cartoons? Remember the old Tom and Jerry cartoons from years ago? And Tom would be struggling with whether or not to axe Jerry, and he had a little angel on one shoulder, a little devil on the other shoulder, and the little angel would say, don't do it, don't do it. And the devil would be like, do it, and he's kind of struggling with what to do and what not to do. And that imagery, in a very simple level, conjures up this idea that the believer has when he struggles with the old nature and the new nature. Between that propensity that we have to behave in an evil way, which all of us have, or that new nature that wants to serve the Lord. And yet within every believer there is both natures, and that war within. And Paul mentions this in Romans 7:18. He says, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me." And then verse 7, he says, "I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good." Now this is the Apostle Paul. Now any growing believer can say the same. Now, I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. I can find myself in the most wonderful Bible study, just having the most wonderful thoughts and times of prayer, and then out of the blue, just the most corrupt thought can enter into my mind. At any time of the day, and that propensity within each and every one of us to behave that way is there in all of us. But especially so in the immature believer. Especially so in the one who is governed by worldliness. Not working. Especially so in the one who is worldly minded. And by the way, are there ever believers that are worldly minded? When we're looking at the Israelites here, are we looking at believers or unbelievers? Believers. Remember, these are the people who were spared at the 10th and final judgment. And what was the 10th and final judgment that came upon Egypt? Anybody? It's the death angel, remember? That passed over. And what was it that they had to do to be spared from the death angel passing over? Remember, what did they have to do? They had to kill the lamb. And they had to put the blood on the doorposts. And by the sacrifice of the lamb and the blood upon the doorpost, when the angel passed up, when the angel came through and he saw that blood on the doorpost, he would then pass over. And that expression of faith was their expression of faith towards God. And it was an indicator that they were among the righteous to be called out. And so these are God's people here. And so Aaron here is giving his excuse. And he turns to Moses and he says, "You know the people yourself, that they are prone to evil." Verse 23. And then Aaron does something here that makes you scratch your head. Verse 23, it says, "For they said to me," and Aaron's about to tell a lie. "For they said to me, make a God for us, who will go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Well, so far so good. "And I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them tear it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Ta-da! So not only is he a weak leader, he's also a lame liar. Moses is 80. Aaron is his older brother by 3 years. Apparently, Aaron wasn't accustomed to lying. He wasn't very polished. You would expect this sort of thing to come from maybe a 5 or 6 year old. You know, I just threw it in, it just came out, it just happened that way. But this is his story, and he's sticking to it. So he says he just threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. And then when Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies. Let me pause there for just a second. For Aaron had let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies. Do unbelievers ever look at believers in derision because of their behavior? Yes. Unfortunately, yes. And that's what we have here. We have the Israelites behaving so poorly that the God who brought them out of Egypt, they have abandoned. They have abandoned God. and turned to idolatry. And their enemies are looking at them and said, you people are something else. Here this God miraculously does all these signs and brings you out, and at the first turn you turn away and you ignore Him and you turn to worshiping pagan gods. And in effect, their poor behavior makes them a derision among the unbelieving nations. And so we have believers here behaving so poorly that they are giving a bad name to God's people. And that happens sometimes with churches too, doesn't it? I mean, even today I see sometimes believers who behave so poorly that unbelievers look and say, really? That's Christianity? Really? And that's what we have here. For Aaron had let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies. Verse 26, Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, Whoever is for the Lord, come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered together to him. And he said to them, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Every man among you put his sword upon his thigh, and go back and forth from gate to gate in the camp, and kill every man his brother, and every man his friend, and every man his neighbor. And by the way here, this is not a killing of everyone, but apparently only those people who were leading the rebellion. The total number of those who are going to fall is going to be about 3,000. But the population of the Israelites who came out of Egypt on the low end is about 2 million, and that could be up as high as 4 million of the people that came out of Egypt. Remember, we talked about in the Exodus how many came out. So of those that are going to fall here, it's going to be a small number, and we can't be dogmatic from the text, but it would seem to be those who caused the rebellion. Verse 28, So the sons of Levi did as Moses instructed, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Verse 29, Then Moses said, and this would be to the Levites, Dedicate yourselves today to the Lord, for every man has been against his son and against his brother, in order that he may bestow a blessing upon you today. Verse 30, On the next day Moses said to the people, You yourselves have committed a great sin. And the idea of a great sin here, I think, communicates the idea that some sins are greater than others. Some sins have farther-reaching ramifications and greater consequences. Even in the New Testament, there is a differentiation of sins. We talked about even the Lord's Supper. Remember, we talked about this a few weeks ago, that when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and you read of those who partook of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. And Paul says, For this reason many among you are weak, a number are sick, and a number sleep. And the word sleep there is a euphemism for death, having been put to death by the Lord, the sin unto death. And so you have these stages of divine discipline eventuating in death, depending upon the sin and the severity of the sin committed. But he points out here, he says, again in verse 30, On the next day Moses said to the people, You yourselves have committed a great sin, and now I am going up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses here is still going to go, and he's still going to advocate for them. And then Moses returned to the Lord and said, Alas, this people has committed a great sin. And by the way, there's honesty. Whenever you're going to go to the Lord and confess sin, you've got to be honest. You've got to just be honest with what the sin is. Don't try to hide it. Be honest about it. Look, the Lord is omniscient. That means He knows everything anyway. Okay? He knows how many hairs are on your head. He knows how many times you blink in a day. He knows how many times your heart beats. He knows your thoughts before you think them. He knows your words before you speak them. He knows every detail of your life. Nothing is hidden from the Lord. So when you do fail, go ahead and own up to it. Just be honest with Him. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, Alas, this people has committed a great sin, and they have made a god of gold for themselves. And then Moses does something interesting here. He says, But now, if you will, forgive their sin. And notice what he says, If not, please blot me out from your book which you have written. In effect, Moses was willing to be judged and die with his people if the Lord would not forgive them. Moses comes to the Lord and he's advocating on their behalf. And he says to the Lord, Lord, forgive them. And if you're not willing to forgive them, if you're going to judge them so as to destroy them, then Moses stands over with the people and he says, let me die with them. Let me be judged with them then. If you're going to blot them out, if you're going to destroy them, then destroy me with them. And so he puts himself with the people. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. It's a great sacrifice Moses is willing to do here. By the way, do these people deserve this? No. It's love and grace and commitment. Commitment on Moses' part. Verse 33, but the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. Ezekiel 18:4 talks about the individual who sins. God says, the soul that sinneth, it will die. God judges each individual as an individual. Verse 34, but go now, lead the people where I told you, behold, my angel shall go before you. My angel here is most likely a reference to the pre-incarnate Christ. He says, nevertheless, in the day when I will punish them for their sin. And then the Lord smote the people because of what they did with the calf which Aaron had made. Very interesting section. Let's take up some summary points on the chapter. The central idea of the text is that Israel breaks covenant with God through idolatry, and Moses intercedes on their behalf. So even though they fail, Moses steps up as a leader and as an interceder on behalf of the people and advocates for them. And the Lord does forgive. Point number 2, the Israelites had turned away from the Lord and broken His covenant. They celebrated their disobedience with a feast and play and singing and dancing that angered the Lord. Though at the moment it brought ephemeral happiness. Does sin bring happiness? It can. I mean, let's be honest.
Very short-lived.
Very short-lived, and there's often consequences.
Yeah, that's why they say that sin is fun.
Yes.
Sin is, that's why people do it. But
yes.
It's not like the life that the Lord offers. That's why there's happiness and joy.
Right. Right, I would totally agree. And there's a consequence that goes with that. There is an enticement. When I used to work in prison ministry for years, I would go and I would talk with guys who were caught up in drugs, and they would tell you that at the moment that they were caught up in it, that it was fun, that there was an enticement. But it was always the afterwards that hurt them, as it destroyed their health, their family, their freedom, as they would eventually wind up with a criminal record or so many years in prison. But at the moment when Moses comes down off the mountain, these people are celebrating. They're eating, drinking, playing. They are singing and dancing. But it's all in sin. It's all in open rebellion against the Lord. And this angered the Lord, even though their sinful behavior brought ephemeral or temporal happiness. In judgment, everyone was made to drink bitter water, and it seems God's judgment fell hardest on those who led the rebellion. Israel's history was at times marked by leaders who personally engaged in idolatry and led God's people to do the same. And I referenced those passages in Kings that I talked about earlier. The first section is in 1 Kings 11, 6 through 10, which talks about Solomon and his turning away from the Lord and introducing the god Molech. And this was after he had built the temple. Remember, after Solomon had built the temple, he then builds these high places of worship to these pagan gods. And the Israelites then engaged in this pagan worship because Solomon led them to it. I mean, you just sit and you just think, how does that happen? Wisest man that ever lived? And yet he ends his life on this down note? And then, other passages, the Ezekiel 16, you can read that at your leisure. Point number 3, Aaron's sin was that he surrendered to sinful pressures of the Israelites and built an idol for the people to worship. Moses prayed for him. By the way, read Deuteronomy 9 when you go home today. Because Deuteronomy 9 gives you Moses' account. It gives you Moses' account years later when he comes out off the mountain. But read it, because you get details from Deuteronomy 9 that you don't get from Exodus 32. But when you read Deuteronomy 9, he recalls the whole incident from a future reference point, and he gives you details that you don't get from Exodus 32. And one of the points is that Moses prayed for Aaron, and the Lord spared his life. Even though he failed like many others in the Bible, Aaron went on to become a great servant of the Lord. This is grace. Now I want to pause for just a second there. Did Aaron fail? How bad was Aaron's failure here? Pretty big? I'd say it's pretty big. I'd say it's probably among the top 10. Right? Pretty big failure. Moses is gone. Aaron's in charge. People come. He caves in like that. They just come as a group and say, hey, make us a god. He's like, all right, give me your gold. No resistance at all. And then he grabs a tool and he melts the gold and he sets up and he makes this calf, and then he leads the celebration. He says, tomorrow we're going to have a celebration to the Lord. This is your God, Yahweh. What? That's pretty big. And yet, Moses prays on behalf of Aaron, Deuteronomy 9:20, the Lord forgives him. Aaron goes on to serve as the high priest of Israel until the end of his days, becomes a great man of God throughout Israel's existence and worship in the wilderness. This is God's grace. Aren't there other leaders that have done the same? Don't we have the recorded account of David's failure? Don't we have the recorded account of Elijah, who is one day standing off against hundreds of false prophets, calling down fire from heaven, and then the very next day he gets a threat? And then he drops everything and runs off into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights and hides in a cave and says, oh, let the rocks fall on me, I'm ready to die. One day he's a spiritual giant, the next day he's a carnal giant. And what happens there? Peter denies the Lord not once, not twice, what? 3 times. In Mark 14:71, it says that when he denied him the 3rd time, he cursed. And by the way, John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of John, supposedly did so under instruction by Peter himself. And John Mark, the Gospel of Mark, is the only one that gives us that information that when he denied the Lord the 3rd time that he cursed, Peter must have personally told him that. That's interesting to me. Because Peter was giving Mark information that he knew would be written down, that everybody would be able to read. And that everybody would know this darkness about Peter, this failure in his life. That it would be revealed to all the world. Think about that. Take the darkest moment of your life and then publish it for all the world to see. And that's what happens here with Peter. And it wasn't that Peter somehow, it's not a success story, that somehow Peter pulled himself up by the straps and changed himself and turned around. What happened? The Lord came to him. The Lord came to him. And what happened after the resurrection? Do you remember when the Lord came and spoke to Mary and he said, go tell the disciples and Peter. Go tell the disciples and Peter. That's no accident. That he singles out Peter because he knew that Peter must have felt so much like a failure. And we know from one of the gospel accounts that when Peter denied the Lord, he heard the cock crow and he turned and he saw the Lord. And it says that he went out and he wept bitterly. That he wept bitterly. His soul must have just been wrenched, having turned and seen the Lord and just having recalled that time when the Lord told him, you will deny me. And having had that sense of failure. And yet the Lord comes to him in his failure, in his denial, in his denunciation. And he comes to Peter and he's willing to call him back and to allow him to be his servant. And one who failed the Lord went on to become one of his greatest servants. That's grace. That's grace. And even though you have God's people here at a low point in their life worshiping a false god, God doesn't throw them away. They're still His people, and He uses them, and they serve Him. And He doesn't throw Aaron away. He forgives him, and He uses Aaron. And in one sense we look and we say, oh, how terrible that Aaron did this. Oh, how terrible this happened. But at the same time, we must take a step back and we must see God's grace. And we must also look at ourselves and be thankful for God's grace in our own lives. Because if we're honest with ourselves, don't we see failure there too? I mean, come on, let's be honest. If we're really honest with ourselves and we stand in the mirror and we think back on our lives, aren't we here today because God has shown us grace? And so in one sense I look at this and I see this horrible failure, and yet I see God's goodness shining through. I see His grace shining through. Point number 4, even though Israel was guilty of terrible sin, Moses advocated and sought the Lord's forgiveness on their behalf, citing covenant promises so that Israel would be spared the Lord's righteous anger. And God heard Moses' prayer and He changed his mind about the harm which He said He would do to His people. And what strikes me here is that Moses shows commitment love. Not feeling love, commitment love towards Israel. By seeking the Lord's interest on their behalf, even though they didn't deserve it. Even though they didn't deserve it, Moses shows a commitment love because he was committed to them as his people. He was committed to them. And Moses revealed that he was willing to die with his people if the Lord would not forgive. And this says something about his character as a godly leader. It says something about Moses and his integrity, that he was willing to stand with his people because he was committed to them. And he was going to stick by them. And he was willing to die with them, even at the point of their greatest failure. And that's commitment love. That is commitment love. Point number 5, the Christian is to live by faith in God and guard himself from idols. Guard himself from idols. I think of in 1 John 5:21, at the end of his epistle in 1 John 5, he closes out and John says, little children, guard yourselves from idols. Guard yourselves from idols. And you know what strikes me about that? Is John is the one who wrote the book of Revelation. Wrote the Gospel of John, the 3 epistles, and he also wrote the book of Revelation. Twice in the book of Revelation, for those of you that have read it, twice in the book of Revelation, when John was receiving information from an angel, he bowed down to the angel and sought to worship it. And twice John was rebuked by the angel and said, stop it, worship God. The Apostle John. The Apostle John, of all people. And I think John knew something about his own heart and about the heart of all of us. And so when he closes out his epistle and he says to them, little children, guard yourselves, protect yourselves from idols. Because the heart of man is prone to stray and to turn. Guard yourselves. As Christians, we are not impervious to the sinful pressures of this world. And sometimes, like Peter, we say, I will never deny you, Lord. Don't we? We take that stand and say, I'll never deny you. But with Peter, what was that? That was an untested statement. It was an untested statement. And when the test came, what happened? He failed. And none of us, as Christians, are impervious to the pressures of this world or this life. And so we must be on guard. We must be vigilant to watch. And so the Christian is to live by faith in God and guard himself from idols. And idolatry can bring ephemeral happiness and worldly pleasure, but it can also bring the Lord's judgment upon those who break covenant with Him. Hebrews 12:5-11 says, He whom the Lord loves, He disciplines. The Lord's love can be those big arms that bring us comfort, but they can also be those big arms that discipline. And it's not because He hates us that He does these things. It's because He loves us enough to give us what we need, to bring us back. Amen?